After finding strange receipts hidden in my husband's gym bag, I followed him to a house across town and parked in the corner. When I saw him walk out with another woman and a little girl who had his same green eyes, calling him Daddy, I realized the man I'd been married to for 8 years was living a complete double life. By that evening, I'd emptied our joint accounts, and by morning, I was planning the most calculated revenge of my life. The receipts felt heavy in my trembling hands as I sat in my car outside 247 Maple Grove Avenue. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. 3 hours earlier, I'd been folding Jimmy's workout clothes, preparing to surprise him with a freshly organized gym bag, the kind of thoughtful gesture that had defined our 8-year marriage. Now, staring at the modest 2-story house with its cheerful yellow shutters and children's toys scattered across the front yard, I felt my entire world tilting on its axis. The receipts told a story I couldn't ignore: monthly grocery bills for a family of 3, children's clothing purchases from Target, birthday decorations, and a receipt from Chuck E. Cheese dated just last weekend. The same weekend, Jimmy claimed he was working overtime at the construction site, but it was the receipt from Walgreens that had stopped my breath entirely: prenatal vitamins and a pregnancy test, purchased 2 weeks ago. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, my engagement ring catching the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windshield. The diamond suddenly felt like a lie against my skin, just like everything else in my carefully constructed life. My name is Katrina Baltimore, and until 3 hours ago, I believed I was happily married to the most devoted man I'd ever known. Jimmy and I had what everyone called a fairy tale romance. We'd met at my sister Eleanor's wedding reception, where he'd been working as part of the catering crew. I was fresh out of college with my marketing degree, dressed in a bridesmaid's dress that made me feel like royalty, and he was this charming, hard-working man who made me laugh until my cheeks hurt. He had these piercing green eyes that seemed to see straight through to my soul, and when he asked me to dance, I felt like I was floating. "You're way out of my league," he'd whispered in my ear that night, and I'd thought it was the sweetest thing anyone had ever said to me. Looking back now, I wondered if that insecurity had been the first red flag I'd chosen to ignore. We'd married 2 years later in a small ceremony that Jimmy insisted we keep intimate. "Just us and the people who really matter," he'd said, and I'd been so touched by his preference for meaningful over flashy. My parents, successful real estate developers from the affluent side of town, had offered to pay for a larger celebration, but Jimmy had seemed uncomfortable with their generosity. "I want to earn my place in your family," he'd told me, and I'd fallen even deeper in love with his pride and integrity. For 8 years, I'd supported his dreams of starting his own construction company. I'd taken the higher-paying marketing job at Gilmore and Associates instead of pursuing my passion for interior design. I'd moved into the apartment he preferred, in the neighborhood he liked, always telling myself that compromise was what marriage was about. When he worked late nights and weekends, I'd bring him dinner at job sites, proud of his dedication and work ethic. The strange thing was, I'd been genuinely happy. Jimmy was attentive, romantic, always remembering anniversaries, and surprising me with little gifts. He'd call me during lunch breaks just to hear my voice, and he never forgot to kiss me goodbye in the mornings. If someone had told me yesterday that my husband was capable of deception, I would have laughed in their face. But sitting in my Honda Civic, watching the house at 247 Maple Grove Avenue, those happy memories began reshaping themselves into something darker. The late nights that became more frequent over the past year, the new phone he'd bought, claiming his old one was breaking down, the way he'd started showering immediately when he came home from work, before even greeting me properly, the gradual decrease in our intimacy, which he'd blamed on exhaustion from his expanding business. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone and scrolled through our recent text messages. "Working late again tonight, babe. Don't wait up. Job site emergency, might not make it home until tomorrow. Client wants to meet Sunday morning, probably an all-day thing." Each message now felt like a carefully crafted lie, designed to give him time with his other life. The front door of the yellow house suddenly opened, and my breath caught in my throat. A woman stepped out onto the porch, petite, with shoulder-length auburn hair and wearing a floral sundress that accentuated her obviously pregnant belly. She couldn't have been more than 25, with the kind of natural beauty that didn't require makeup. She was everything I wasn't, young where I was approaching 32, effortlessly pretty where I worked hard to maintain my appearance, pregnant where I had struggled with fertility issues for the past 3 years. But it was what happened next that shattered my heart into a million irreparable pieces. Jimmy emerged from the house behind her, wearing the same Carhartt work shirt I'd washed and folded a dozen times. In his arms was a little girl who couldn't have been more than 3 years old, with dark curls and unmistakably familiar green eyes, Jimmy's eyes. She was giggling and calling him daddy in a sweet high voice that carried across the quiet suburban street. I watched, frozen in horror and disbelief, as Jimmy kissed the woman's forehead tenderly, the same way he'd kissed mine that very morning when I'd handed him his coffee. He settled the little girl into a car seat in the back of a silver SUV I'd never seen before, taking the time to make silly faces that made her laugh. The intimacy between them was undeniable. This wasn't a casual relationship or a recent affair, this was a family. My vision blurred with tears as the full scope of his betrayal crashed over me like a tsunami. This wasn't just an affair, this was a complete double life, stretching back years. The little girl looked old enough to be 3, maybe 4, which meant this had been going on since almost the beginning of our marriage. While I'd been struggling with fertility treatments, enduring painful procedures and hormone injections, hoping desperately to give Jimmy the family he claimed to want with me, he'd already had one with someone else. The silver SUV pulled out of the driveway, Jimmy behind the wheel, his other family safely buckled in beside him. As they drove past my hiding spot, I ducked down instinctively, my heart pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it. But they were too absorbed in their own happiness to notice the broken woman watching from the shadows of their perfect afternoon. When their car disappeared around the corner, I sat up slowly, my entire body trembling with a mixture of devastation and something else, something cold and calculating that I'd never felt before. This wasn't just about infidelity. This was about a man who had systematically lied to me for years, who had stolen my time, my fertility, my trust, and my dreams while building a life with someone else. I started my car with shaking hands, my mind already beginning to race with questions that demanded answers. How long had this been going on? How had he managed to maintain 2 households? How many lies had he told me? And most importantly, what was I going to do about it? As I drove home through the familiar streets of our neighborhood, everything looked different. The house we'd saved for together, the restaurant where we'd had our first date, the park where he'd proposed, all of it now felt like elaborate stage sets in a play where I'd been the only one who didn't know I was acting. By the time I pulled into our driveway, my tears had stopped falling. In their place was a cold, clear determination that surprised me with its intensity. Jimmy Baltimore thought he could play me for a fool, thought he could have his cake and eat it too, while I waited faithfully at home like an obedient wife. He was about to learn just how wrong he was. I sat in our driveway for what felt like hours, though the clock on my dashboard showed only 20 minutes had passed since I'd witnessed Jimmy's betrayal. Our house, a modest 3-bedroom ranch that we'd bought together 5 years ago, looked exactly the same as when I'd left it that morning. The same white picket fence Jimmy had painted last spring, the same rose bushes I'd carefully tended in our front garden, the same welcome mat that read the Baltimores in cheerful script that I'd ordered as a surprise for our 6th anniversary, but everything was different now. The house felt like a museum of lies, each memory suddenly tainted with the knowledge that while I was building what I thought was our life together, Jimmy was building another one entirely with someone else. My hands were still shaking as I fumbled with my keys at the front door. The key stuck in the lock, something that had happened a dozen times before and never bothered me. Today it felt like the universe's cruel joke, forcing me to struggle to enter a home that might never feel like home again. When the door finally opened, I was hit with the familiar scent of the vanilla candles I kept burning in the living room, mixed with the faint smell of Jimmy's cologne that always lingered in the entryway. I dropped my purse on the small table by the door, the antique piece I'd found at a flea market, and spent weeks refinishing while Jimmy was working late. Now I wondered how many of those late nights had been spent tucking his daughter into bed, reading her bedtime stories, being the father I'd dreamed of him becoming with our children. The receipts were still clutched in my other hand, now slightly crumpled from my death grip during the drive home. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I spread them out on our kitchen counter, the same granite surface where Jimmy and I had shared countless breakfasts, where he'd surprised me with birthday cakes, where we'd planned our future together over Sunday morning coffee. Receipt after receipt told the story of a life I knew nothing about, grocery purchases from a store I'd never been to, in amounts that would feed a family, children's vitamins from CVS, a birthday party package from Chuck E. Cheese, dated 3 weeks ago, March 15th. I grabbed my phone and checked my calendar. March 15th was the day Jimmy had claimed he was working a double shift on the Morrison renovation project. He'd even called me that evening, sounding exhausted, telling me he missed me and couldn't wait to come home. But he hadn't come home to me. He'd gone home to them. I sank onto one of our kitchen stools, the same ones Jimmy had assembled when we first moved in, insisting he could handle it without the instruction manual. We'd laughed when one of them ended up wobbly, and I'd called him my handyman husband with such affection. That memory now felt like a knife twisting in my chest. My phone buzzed with a text message, and Jimmy's name appeared on the screen. "Hey beautiful, running behind schedule today, probably won't be home until after 8. Love you." I stared at the message, knowing now that he was probably helping his other family with dinner, maybe giving his daughter a bath, maybe rubbing his pregnant girlfriend's feet. The casual "love you" at the end felt like mockery. How could he type those words while living this double life? I found myself walking through our house like a detective examining a crime scene. In our bedroom, I opened Jimmy's dresser drawers with new eyes. Had I ever noticed that he seemed to go through clothes faster than made sense? That his laundry loads were smaller than they should be for someone who worked in construction? In the back of his sock drawer, I found a second wallet, one I'd never seen before. My heart pounded as I opened it. Inside was a driver's license with Jimmy's photo, but a different address, 247 Maple Grove Avenue. The same house I'd just watched him emerge from with his secret family. The license listed his name as James Keene, not James Baltimore. Even his name with them was different. There were other things in the wallet too. Photos of the little girl I'd seen today, dozens of them, documenting her growth from a tiny baby to the toddler I'd witnessed, calling him daddy. In one photo, she was maybe 6 months old, sitting on Jimmy's lap in what looked like our local park. The timestamp showed it was taken 2 years ago, during the period when Jimmy claimed he was working overtime to save for the vacation we never took. Another photo showed the auburn-haired woman in a hospital bed, holding a newborn baby, with Jimmy standing beside them both, his face glowing with pride and exhaustion. The kind of photo I'd imagined we'd have someday, when we finally managed to conceive. The date stamp showed it was taken 3.5 years ago, just 4.5 years into our marriage. I sank onto our bed, the same bed where Jimmy had held me just last week when I'd cried after another negative pregnancy test. He'd stroked my hair and whispered that everything happens for a reason, that maybe it just wasn't our time yet, all while knowing he already had a daughter, while another child was growing in another woman's belly. The cruelest part was how genuine his comfort had seemed. There were no signs that he was acting, no tells that he was lying. He'd seemed as disappointed as I was about our fertility struggles, as hopeful about the treatments we were pursuing. How could someone be such a convincing actor? I thought about all the times I'd defended him to my family. My mother had always been politely skeptical of Jimmy, not because she disliked him, but because she couldn't understand what he was thinking, what his long-term plans were. "He's very easygoing," she'd say in that careful tone mothers use when they're trying not to criticize their daughter's choices. My father had offered Jimmy a job at his real estate development company multiple times, opportunities that would have doubled his income, but Jimmy always declined. "I'm a hands-on guy," he'd say. "I need to build something with my own 2 hands." Now I realized he had been building something with his own hands, just not with me. The house phone rang, startling me out of my spiral of memories. It was Eleanor, my sister, her name appearing on the caller ID. "Hey, Kat," she said when I answered, her voice warm and familiar. I was just calling to confirm Sunday dinner. Mom's making her famous pot roast, and you know how she gets when people don't show up for her pot roast. Sunday dinner. Our weekly family tradition that Jimmy had been attending for 8 years, charming my parents with his work stories and his easy laugh. Had he been rushing off afterward to have dinner with his other family? Had he been living his actual life after enduring what he probably saw as an obligation to mine? Katrina? You there? Yeah. I managed, my voice sounding strange even to my own ears. I'm here. Everything okay? You sound weird. I looked around at our bedroom, at the evidence of Jimmy's double life scattered across our comforter, at the photos of his daughter that had been hidden just feet from where I slept every night. Everything's fine, I lied, just like Jimmy had been lying to me for years. We'll be there Sunday. But even as I said it, I knew that by Sunday everything in my life would be different. By Sunday, Jimmy Baltimore would know that his carefully constructed house of lies was about to come crashing down around him. I just had to figure out how to make sure I was the one controlling the demolition. After hanging up with Eleanor, I found myself standing in front of our hallway photo gallery, a collection of framed memories that Jimmy and I had carefully curated over the years. Wedding photos, vacation snapshots, holiday celebrations with my family. Each image now felt like evidence in a case I was building against my own life. There was our wedding photo, taken 8 years ago at the small ceremony we'd held at Eleanor's country club. I was radiant in my grandmother's vintage lace dress, and Jimmy looked handsome in his rented tuxedo, his green eyes sparkling with what I'd believed was pure joy. We'd written our own vows, and I remembered how Jimmy's voice had cracked when he promised to love, honor, and cherish only you for all the days of my life. Only me. What a joke. I was born Katrina Ann Gilmore, the younger daughter of Robert and Patricia Gilmore, two of the most successful real estate developers in the tri-state area. Growing up, I'd lived in a world of privilege that I'd never fully appreciated until I met Jimmy. Our family estate sat on 12 acres of manicured grounds, complete with a pool house larger than most people's homes, and a 3-car garage that housed my father's collection of vintage Porsches. But despite the wealth, my parents had raised Eleanor and me with strong values about hard work and earning your place in the world. My father, who'd built Gilmore Developments from nothing after immigrating from Ireland with $500 and a fierce determination, never let us forget that money was a tool, not an identity. Money makes you comfortable, girls, he'd tell us during his frequent lectures over Sunday dinner, but character makes you worthy of comfort. Eleanor, 3 years older than me, had embraced the family business from childhood. She had our father's head for numbers and our mother's eye for design, and by the time she was 25 she was already running her own division of the company. She'd married Archie Javier, a successful attorney from a similar background, and together they'd built the kind of life that looked perfect from the outside, and actually was pretty wonderful on the inside too. I, on the other hand, had always been the dreamer. While Eleanor was studying business and finance, I was taking art classes and interior design courses. I'd wanted to start my own design firm, maybe specialize in historic home renovations. My parents had been supportive but practical about it. Follow your passion, sweetheart, my mother had said, but make sure you can support yourself while you're following it. That's why I'd taken the marketing position at Gilmore and Associates. It was supposed to be temporary, a way to build up savings and experience while I launched my design career. But then I'd met Jimmy at Eleanor's wedding reception, and everything changed. He was working with the catering company that night, but he wasn't just another server. He was the one directing traffic, solving problems, making sure everything ran smoothly. I'd watched him handle a crisis when the main course ran late. He'd quietly reorganized the entire service flow without anyone except me even noticing there had been a problem. When he asked me to dance during the band's break, I was already intrigued. He was different from the men I usually met, the sons of my parents' friends, the young executives climbing corporate ladders, the trust fund boys who never seemed to want anything badly enough to actually work for it. Jimmy wanted things. He talked about building something with his hands, about creating lasting structures that would shelter families for generations. He had calluses on his palms and sawdust under his fingernails, and when he smiled, it reached his eyes in a way that made me believe he was genuinely happy to be talking to me. What do? He'd asked as we swayed to the music. I'm in marketing, I'd said, then immediately felt compelled to add, "But I really want to be an interior designer." "Why aren't you?" The question had caught me off guard. Most people, when I mentioned my design dreams, would nod politely, and then change the subject, or offer some variation of "That's nice, dear." Jimmy seemed genuinely interested in my answer. "I guess I'm playing it safe," I'd admitted, "building up experience and savings first." He'd nodded thoughtfully. "Nothing wrong with being practical, but don't let practical turn into never." That conversation had haunted me for weeks afterward. Jimmy Baltimore. That's how he'd introduced himself, and I'd never questioned why his last name was different from what I'd later learn it really was. Seemed to represent everything I'd been missing in my carefully planned life. Spontaneity. Authenticity. The courage to chase dreams without a safety net. We'd started dating 2 weeks after Eleanor's wedding. Jimmy would pick me up after work in his beat-up Ford pickup truck, and we'd go to little diners and local bars that I'd never known existed. He introduced me to a world where people worked with their hands, where success was measured in completed projects rather than quarterly reports, where Friday night meant beer and pool rather than wine and gallery openings. My parents had been diplomatically concerned. "He seems like a very nice young man," my mother had said after Jimmy's first dinner with the family. "Very polite." "But what are his long-term goals?" my father had asked privately. "What's his plan for building a stable future?" I defended Jimmy passionately. He was hardworking, honest, ambitious in his own way. He was saving money to start his own construction company. He treated me like a queen. He made me laugh. He made me feel like my dreams mattered. "He's not after your money if that's what you're worried about," I'd told them. "He's actually uncomfortable when I try to pay for things." And that had been true, at least at first. Jimmy had insisted on paying for our dates, even when it meant choosing less expensive restaurants. He'd refused my father's job offers, saying he needed to make his own way. When I'd offered to help him financially with his business plans, he'd been almost offended. "I appreciate it, Kat, I really do," he'd said. "But I need to know I can do this on my own. I need to know I'm worthy of you." Looking back now, I wondered if his pride had been genuine, or just another manipulation. Had he been playing hard to get with my money, knowing that my parents' wealth would always be there as a safety net? Had he calculated that refusing help initially would make him seem more trustworthy when he eventually started accepting it? Because he had started accepting it, gradually and seemingly reluctantly. First, it was letting me pay for nicer dinners. Then it was agreeing to move into a better apartment that I found and offered to split the rent on. Then it was the business loan I'd co-signed when he was ready to start Baltimore construction. By the time we got married, Jimmy had become comfortable with my family's money, though he still maintained the fiction that he was uncomfortable with it. He'd joke about being the poor boy who'd married above his station, but he'd gotten used to the vacations my parents funded, the family events at expensive restaurants, the birthday and Christmas gifts that cost more than he made in a month, and all the while I'd thought I was helping the man I loved achieve his dreams. I'd thought we were building something together. Now, standing in our hallway looking at 8 years of photographed lies, I realized that Jimmy had been building something, just not with me. While I was supporting his construction business, he was constructing an entirely separate life. While I was investing in our future, he was investing in someone else's. The worst part was how naturally the deception had come to him. In all our years together, I'd never once suspected he was capable of this level of betrayal. He'd been the perfect husband, attentive, loving, thoughtful. He remembered anniversaries and birthdays, brought me flowers for no reason, held me when I cried about our fertility struggles. Had any of it been real, or was I just another construction project to Jimmy, something to build and maintain, while working on his real passion project across town? As I stared at our wedding photo, I realized I was looking at a stranger. The man I'd married didn't exist. Jimmy Baltimore was just a character James Keene had created to access my life, my resources, my trust. But if Jimmy Baltimore was just a fictional character, then maybe it was time for Katrina Baltimore to become one too. Maybe it was time for Katrina Gilmore to resurface, the woman with resources, connections, and a family who would go to war for her. Jimmy had underestimated who he was really married to. That was going to be his biggest mistake. I walked into Jimmy's home office, a small room we'd converted from what was supposed to be our future nursery. The irony wasn't lost on me now. While I'd been dreaming of filling that room with a crib and baby clothes, Jimmy had been busy raising a child in another house entirely. His desk was meticulously organized, which should have been my first clue. Jimmy was naturally messy. He left tools scattered around job sites, threw his work clothes in random piles, could never find his car keys. But his office was different. Every paper was filed, every pen had its place, every document was exactly where it should be. Now I understood why. This wasn't casual disorganization. This was careful compartmentalization. He couldn't afford to have evidence of his double life accidentally surface. I started pulling open drawers, looking for anything I might have missed over the years. In the bottom drawer, behind a stack of old construction magazines, I found a day planner from 3 years ago. My hands trembled as I flipped through it, seeing appointments and notations that told a story I'd never been privy to. Marjorie doctor at 2 p.m. Marjorie, that must be her name, the pregnant woman I'd seen at the house. The entries were scattered throughout the year, always cryptic, always scheduled during times when Jimmy had told me he was working. Modem ultrasound, baby shower planning, Lamaze class. While I was taking fertility drugs that made me sick and emotional, while I was enduring painful procedures and monthly disappointments, Jimmy was attending Lamaze classes with another woman. He was shopping for baby clothes, setting up nurseries, experiencing all the pregnancy milestones I'd dreamed about sharing with him. I found more entries as I kept flipping. Lily's first steps. Lily says data. Lily's first birthday party. Lily, his daughter's name was Lily. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Jimmy. Traffic is crazy today. Might be closer to 9 before I'm home. Sorry babe. I looked at the clock. It was 6:30 p.m. Prime dinner and bedtime routine time for a family with a toddler. He wasn't stuck in traffic. He was probably helping Marjorie give Lily a bath, reading her a bedtime story, being the father he pretended he wanted to be with me. Suddenly memories started flooding back with horrible clarity. All the signs that I'd dismissed, rationalized, or simply failed to see. 2 years ago, I'd found a child's hair tie in Jimmy's truck. When I'd asked about it, he'd laughed and said one of the guys on his crew had borrowed the truck to move his ex-wife's stuff, and she must have had her kid with her. I'd thought it was sweet that Jimmy was helping his coworker navigate a difficult divorce. Last Christmas, I'd been looking for a receipt in Jimmy's wallet to return a gift, and I'd found a photo of a little girl I didn't recognize. When I'd asked, he'd said it was his coworker Gary's daughter, and Gary was so proud of her that he'd given everyone on the crew copies of her school picture. You know how dads get, he'd said, with such an affectionate smile that I'd thought it was endearing. Gary. I grabbed Jimmy's phone records from his desk file and started scanning through the numbers. There it was, a number listed as Gary Work that appeared in Jimmy's call log almost daily, sometimes multiple times per day. Sometimes the calls lasted just minutes, but others went on for half an hour or more. What kind of work conversations needed to happen that frequently? I called the number from my cell phone, my heart pounding. Hello? A woman's voice answered, soft and slightly out of breath. I hung up immediately, my hands shaking. Gary wasn't a coworker. Gary was probably a code name for his other life, the way James had become Jimmy when he was with me. More memories surfaced, each one now taking on a sinister new meaning. The weekend trips Jimmy took with the crew to work on out-of-town projects. The new clothes that appeared in his wardrobe that I hadn't bought for him. Things that were a little too stylish, a little too expensive for someone who supposedly spent all his money on business expenses. When I'd complimented him on a particularly nice sweater, he'd said Gary's wife had picked it up for him while she was shopping for her husband. Gary's wife, Marjorie. I thought about all the times Jimmy had encouraged me to take girls' trips with Eleanor, to visit my college roommates in other cities, to spend long weekends at my parents' lake house. I'd been so grateful to have a husband who encouraged my independence, who didn't get jealous when I wanted to spend time away from home. Now I realized he'd been orchestrating my absences so he could have uninterrupted time with his real family. The fertility issues suddenly made horrible sense too. For 3 years we'd been trying to have a baby. I'd tracked my cycle religiously, taken my temperature every morning, used ovulation prediction kits. Jimmy had seemed as eager as I was, always willing to accommodate my carefully timed romantic schedules. But now I realized he'd been sabotaging our efforts from the beginning. I thought about all the times he'd suggested we have a glass of wine before bed during my fertile windows, even though he knew alcohol could affect conception. The way he'd always volunteer to make dinner during those crucial days, disappearing into the kitchen for long periods. Had he been putting something in my food? Birth control pills crushed into my drinks. The thought made me physically sick. I ran to our bathroom and dry heaved over the toilet, my body rejecting not just the possibility, but the certainty of his betrayal. When the nausea passed, I splashed cold water on my face and stared at myself in the mirror. My reflection looked haunted, aged by the revelations of the past few hours. But underneath the devastation, I could see something else emerging: anger. I walked back to Jimmy's office and started going through his files more systematically. His business records showed a thriving construction company, but the numbers didn't add up. His reported income was lower than what I knew he was actually making, which meant he was hiding money somewhere, probably supporting his other household. In his tax returns, I found discrepancies that suggested he'd been filing separately from me in some capacity, or at least not reporting all his income on our joint returns. Had he been setting up some kind of tax fraud to funnel money to Marjorie and Lily? My phone rang, and Eleanor's name appeared on the screen again. "Hey," I answered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Okay, something's definitely wrong," she said without preamble. "You sounded weird earlier, and I've been worried about you all afternoon. What's going on?" I looked around Jimmy's office, at the evidence of his systematic deception scattered across his desk, at the photo of Lily that I'd found tucked behind his computer monitor. I said slowly. "How well do you really know Jimmy?" There was a pause. "What do you mean?" "I mean, have you ever had any doubts about him? Any weird feelings or concerns that you didn't want to tell me because you thought I wouldn't want to hear them?" Another pause, longer this time. "Katrina, what's happened? Just answer me, please." Eleanor sighed. "There have been things, little things that never quite added up. Like how he always seemed to know exactly what to say, when to say it. How he never really talked about his past, his family, his life before you. And," she hesitated, "and what? And Archie ran a background check on him before your wedding. I know that sounds awful and invasive, but you know how protective he is of family. Some things didn't quite match up, employment histories that had gaps, references that were hard to verify, but nothing concrete enough to worry you with, especially since you were so happy." My blood ran cold. "What kind of gaps?" "I don't remember all the details, but Archie could tell you." "Katrina, what's going on? You're scaring me." I closed my eyes, feeling the last pieces of my perfect marriage crumbling around me. Even my family had suspected something was wrong with Jimmy, but they'd stayed quiet to protect my happiness. "I need to call you back," I said. "But when I do, I'm going to need your help. And Archie's, of course, whatever you need." After I hung up, I sat in Jimmy's chair and looked around the room that had housed his lies for 8 years. Every file, every carefully organized document, every hidden appointment, it was all evidence of a man I'd never really known. But I was done being the naive wife who explained away red flags and believed convenient lies. It was time to find out who James Keene really was, and what else he'd been hiding from me. And then it was time to destroy him. The morning that changed everything had started so ordinarily. I'd woken up at 6:30 a.m. to the sound of Jimmy's alarm, just like every other Tuesday for the past 8 years. He'd rolled over and kissed my forehead, his stubble scratching against my skin in the familiar way that usually made me smile. "Morning, beautiful," he'd murmured, his voice thick with sleep. "Coffee, please," I'd replied, stretching under our navy blue comforter, the one we'd picked out together at Pottery Barn 3 years ago, when we'd redecorated the bedroom. Everything in our house had a story, a shared memory of choosing it together. Now I wondered how many of those memories were contaminated by his lies. Jimmy had padded to the kitchen in his boxers, and the old construction company t-shirt he'd worn to bed, his dark hair sticking up at odd angles. Through our bedroom doorway, I could hear him moving around, the familiar sounds of our morning routine, the coffee maker gurgling to life, the soft thud of cabinet doors, the clink of ceramic mugs. I'd used those few minutes to check my phone, scrolling through emails and social media posts. Eleanor had shared photos from her weekend trip to Napa with Archie, looking radiant and happy at various wineries. My college roommate Betty Keene had posted pictures of her new apartment in Seattle, where she'd moved for a job promotion. Normal people living normal lives, making normal memories. When Jimmy returned with my coffee, prepared exactly the way I liked it, with a splash of vanilla creamer and half a sugar packet, he'd sat on the edge of the bed while I sipped it. This was our ritual, these few quiet minutes before the day officially began. "What's your schedule like today?" I'd asked, watching him scroll through his phone. "Pretty packed," he'd said without looking up. "Got that kitchen renovation on Elm Street to finish up, then a consultation for a deck addition out in Riverside. Probably won't be home until after 7, I'd nodded, used to his long days. Jimmy's construction business had been growing steadily, and I was proud of how hard he worked to build something from nothing. Or at least, that's what I'd thought he was doing. "Don't forget your gym bag," I'd said, gesturing to where it sat by our dresser. "I'll throw your clothes in the wash while you're gone." "You're the best," he'd said, leaning over to kiss me properly this time. His lips had tasted like coffee, and the mint toothpaste he'd used before coming back to bed. "I love you, Kat. Love you too." After he'd left for work, another kiss goodbye at the front door, another promise to text me during his lunch break. I'd gone about my usual Tuesday routine: shower, breakfast, checking emails from my marketing clients at Gilmore and Associates. I'd had a conference call at 10 with a potential new client, a boutique hotel chain looking to rebrand their image. It was around noon when I'd decided to surprise Jimmy by organizing his gym bag. He'd been complaining lately that he could never find anything in it, that his workout clothes were always wrinkled or dirty when he needed them. I'd thought it would be a sweet gesture, the kind of thoughtful thing that kept marriages strong after 8 years. The bag had been sitting on the floor by his side of the bed, a generic black duffel bag he'd had since college. I'd unzipped it, expecting to find the usual chaos of workout clothes, protein bars, and forgotten socks. Instead, I'd found something much more organized than Jimmy's usual standards. There were workout clothes, yes, but they were neatly folded in a way that Jimmy never folded anything. There was a toiletry bag with a travel-sized shampoo, deodorant, and a toothbrush, which seemed excessive for someone who showered at home after the gym, and there were the receipts. They'd been tucked into a side pocket, along with what looked like appointment cards and handwritten notes. At first glance, they'd seemed innocent enough. Everyone accumulated random receipts. But something about the careful way they'd been stored, almost like they were being saved intentionally, had made me look closer. That's when I'd seen the patterns that didn't make sense. Grocery receipts from stores I'd never heard of Jimmy shopping at. Receipts for children's items from Target and Walmart. A receipt from a maternity store that had made my heart skip a beat, until I'd convinced myself it must be for a coworker's wife or sister. The restaurant receipts had been the most confusing. Meals for multiple people at family-friendly places like Applebee's and Olive Garden, always on weekends when Jimmy claimed to be working or hanging out with his crew. The dates and times were meticulously documented, as if someone was keeping track of family outings. I'd sat on our bedroom floor, surrounded by evidence of a life I didn't recognize, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The logical part of my mind had searched for innocent explanations. Maybe Jimmy was helping a coworker who was going through a divorce, buying things for his kids. Maybe he was planning some kind of surprise for me, though what kind of surprise would involve children's clothes and prenatal vitamins was beyond my imagination. But deep down, in the part of my mind that I'd been training to ignore red flags for 8 years, I'd known. The receipts told a story that had nothing to do with coworkers or surprises. They told the story of a man living a double life, supporting a family I knew nothing about. The address on several of the receipts had been consistent deliveries and purchases made near Maple Grove Avenue. I'd never heard Jimmy mention that area of town, had never had any reason to go there myself. But according to these receipts, Jimmy had been spending a lot of time and money there. That's when I'd made the decision that would change everything. Instead of confronting Jimmy directly, instead of demanding explanations that he would probably lie his way through, I decided to see for myself what was happening at 247 Maple Grove Avenue. I'd grabbed my purse, my keys, and the receipts, and driven across town to discover the truth about my husband's secret life. Now, hours later, sitting in his office, surrounded by 8 years of carefully hidden evidence, I realized that my impulse to investigate, rather than confront, had probably saved my sanity. If I'd asked Jimmy about the receipts, he would have had explanations ready. He'd been lying to me successfully for years. What was one more lie? But seeing him with Marjorie and Lily, seeing the easy intimacy of their family dynamic, seeing the way he looked at them with genuine love and affection, that was something he couldn't explain away. That was the truth he'd been hiding from me for years. Sitting in Jimmy's office, surrounded by the evidence of his betrayal, my mind drifted back to all the sacrifices I'd made for what I'd believed was our shared future. 8 years of putting his dreams before mine, his needs before my own, his version of our life before any vision I might have had. It had started small, the way these things always do. 6 months into our relationship, when Jimmy had been laid off from his construction job due to a slowdown in the housing market, I'd offered to cover our dinner dates until he found new work. Just temporarily, he'd said, his pride clearly wounded. I'll pay you back every penny. He never did pay me back, but by the time his finances stabilized, it had seemed petty to bring it up. Love wasn't about keeping score, I'd told myself. Partners supported each other through difficult times. When we'd moved in together after 2 years of dating, I'd been the one to put down the security deposit and first month's rent on our apartment. Jimmy's credit had some temporary issues from his period of unemployment, he'd explained. Nothing serious, just a few late payments that would clear up soon. I'd been happy to help, viewing it as an investment in our future together. The pattern had continued when we'd started talking about marriage. Jimmy had wanted to propose properly, with a ring that reflected how much he loved me, but his savings account wasn't quite where he'd hoped it would be. I want to do this right, Kat, he'd said, his green eyes earnest and vulnerable. You deserve the perfect ring, the perfect proposal. Can you just give me a few more months to save up? But I'd been so ready to marry him, so eager to start our official life together, that I'd taken matters into my own hands. I'd told him I didn't need an expensive ring, that his love was more valuable than any diamond. When he'd still seemed troubled by his inability to afford what he considered an appropriate engagement ring, I'd suggested we pick one out together. My early wedding gift to us both. We'd spent an afternoon at Tiffany & Company, where I'd fallen in love with a classic solitaire setting that cost more than Jimmy made in 3 months. It's perfect, he'd said, watching the diamond catch the light. You're going to look so beautiful wearing this. I'd handed over my credit card without hesitation, caught up in his excitement and the romance of the moment. The saleswoman had assumed Jimmy was paying, and when she'd looked surprised to see me handling the transaction, Jimmy had smoothly explained that I was an independent woman who insisted on contributing to her own engagement. The wedding had followed the same pattern. My parents had offered to pay for everything, but Jimmy had been uncomfortable with their generosity. I want to contribute, he'd insisted. I don't want people thinking I'm just marrying you for your family's money. So we'd split the costs, though Jimmy's idea of splitting meant I covered the venue, catering, flowers, photography and music, while he paid for the rings and the honeymoon. His portion had come to about 15% of the total cost, but I'd appreciated his desire to contribute what he could. The honeymoon itself had been magical, a week in Tuscany that Jimmy had planned meticulously. He'd booked charming bed and breakfasts, made dinner reservations at romantic restaurants, arranged private wine tastings at family-owned vineyards. I'd been so impressed by his attention to detail, so touched by the effort he'd put into making our trip special. It wasn't until we'd returned home, and I'd offered to help him with the wedding expenses, that I'd discovered the truth. Jimmy hadn't actually paid for anything. He'd charged everything to credit cards, thinking he'd figure out the payments later. The honeymoon alone had cost $25,000 that he didn't have. I wanted to give you the perfect honeymoon, he'd said when I'd found the credit card statements mixed in with our mail. I thought the business would pick up by the time the bills came due, but the market's still slow. I'd paid off the honeymoon debt without a second thought. We were married now, his problems were my problems. His dreams were my dreams. That philosophy had guided every major decision we'd made as a couple. When Jimmy had wanted to start his own construction company, I'd been his biggest cheerleader and his primary investor. I'd co-signed the business loan, using my excellent credit and my parents' wealth as collateral. When he'd needed equipment, I'd helped him lease a truck and purchase tools. When potential clients had wanted to see a portfolio of his work, I'd paid for professional photography of his projects. I'd even used my connections to help build his client base. My father's real estate development company had thrown several renovation contracts Jimmy's way, and I'd convinced friends and family members to hire Baltimore Construction for their home improvement needs. Within 3 years, Jimmy's business was thriving, and I'd been so proud of what we'd built together. But it hadn't been enough for Jimmy to just run a successful business. He'd had bigger dreams, he'd told me. He'd wanted to expand into commercial construction, maybe even development projects like my father's company. That would require more capital, more equipment, more connections. So I'd helped him apply for a line of credit, again using my assets as collateral. I'd introduced him to my father's business associates, gotten him invited to industry events where he could network with potential clients. When he'd needed to hire additional crew members, I'd helped him navigate the payroll and insurance requirements. All the while I'd been putting my own dreams on hold. The interior design business I'd planned to start remained just a plan. The portfolio I'd been building gathered dust in a folder on my laptop. When potential clients had approached me about design projects, I'd turned them down, explaining that I was too busy helping Jimmy establish his business. Once Baltimore Construction is really stable, I'd tell myself, then I'll have time to focus on my own career. But Baltimore Construction's stability had always seemed just out of reach. There was always another expansion opportunity, another piece of equipment needed, another contract that required upfront investment. My design dreams had been perpetually postponed for the sake of our financial security. I'd told myself it was temporary, that we were building something together that would benefit both of us in the long run. I'd convinced myself that supporting Jimmy's success was the same as investing in my own future. Looking back now, I could see how naive I'd been. While I'd been sacrificing my career, my dreams, and my financial independence to build what I'd thought was our shared future, Jimmy had been using my resources to fund an entirely separate life. Every dollar I'd invested in Baltimore Construction, every contact I'd shared, every opportunity I'd helped him secure, it had all been used to support his real family while keeping me in the dark. The cruelest part was how grateful he'd always seemed for my support. He'd thanked me constantly, told me he couldn't have succeeded without me, promised that everything he was building was for us. Even as recently as last month, when I'd helped him secure a major renovation contract through one of my father's contacts, he'd held me close and whispered, "I'm going to spend the rest of my life making this up to you." But he'd never intended to spend the rest of his life with me at all. I was just a convenient source of funding and connections, a stepping stone to the life he really wanted with someone else. 8 years of my life, my money, my connections, my dreams, all of it had been stolen to build a future I'd never be part of. But Jimmy had made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated exactly what kind of resources I had access to, and what I was capable of when I set my mind to destroying someone who'd betrayed me. He was about to learn that Katrina Gilmore didn't just have money, she had power, and she was about to use every bit of it. The drive to 247 Maple Grove Avenue had felt like the longest 20 minutes of my life, even though I'd made the trip in complete autopilot, my hands gripping the steering wheel while my mind raced through 1,000 possible explanations for the receipts I'd found. I'd left our house at 1:30 p.m., telling myself I was just going to drive by whatever was at that address. Maybe it was a store Jimmy frequented, or a client's house where he was working on a project. There had to be an innocent explanation for why his gym bag was full of receipts from that neighborhood. But even as I'd tried to convince myself of benign possibilities, my stomach had been twisted in knots. Something deep in my intuition, the same instinct I'd been suppressing for months, was screaming that I was about to discover something that would change everything. The route had taken me through parts of town I rarely visited. Past the industrial district where Jimmy's office warehouse was located, through a working-class neighborhood of small ranch houses and chain restaurants, and finally into a suburban development that looked like it had been built in the 1990s. Maple Grove Avenue was lined with modest 2-story homes, each with small front yards and driveways that could fit 2 cars if you were careful about the parking. I'd found 247 easily enough, a cheerful yellow house with white trim and dark green shutters. There was a small covered porch with 2 rocking chairs, and the front yard was well maintained but not professionally landscaped. It looked like the kind of place where a young family might live, saving money for a bigger house someday. There were toys scattered across the front yard, a pink tricycle, some sidewalk chalk, a sandbox shaped like a turtle. My heart had started beating faster as I'd parked across the street, about 3 houses down where I could observe without being obvious. The house had looked peaceful, normal. There was a silver Honda Civic in the driveway, a practical family car, the kind I'd always imagined Jimmy and I might buy when we started having children. Wind chimes hung from the porch ceiling, moving gently in the afternoon breeze. I'd sat in my car for nearly an hour, feeling increasingly foolish. What was I even doing here? What did I expect to find? Jimmy was supposed to be working on the Elm Street renovation today. He'd probably never even been to this address. I was letting my imagination run wild, creating drama where none existed. But just as I'd been about to give up and drive home, ashamed of my paranoid behavior, I'd seen movement through the front window of the house. A woman had walked past, carrying what looked like a laundry basket. She'd been too far away for me to see clearly, but she'd appeared young, with shoulder-length hair. My pulse had quickened, but I'd forced myself to stay rational. Just because a woman lived at this address didn't mean anything sinister was happening. Maybe Jimmy had a female client, or maybe one of his crew members lived here with his wife. Then the front door had opened. A woman had stepped out onto the porch, the same woman I'd glimpsed through the window, but now I could see her clearly. She was petite and pretty, probably in her mid-20s, with auburn hair that caught the sunlight. She'd been wearing a flowing sundress that did nothing to hide her obviously pregnant belly. My breath had caught in my throat. Pregnant. The prenatal vitamins on the receipts suddenly made terrible sense. But it was what happened next that had shattered my world completely. Jimmy had emerged from the house behind her. My Jimmy. My husband of 8 years. Wearing the same clothes he'd put on that morning when he'd kissed me goodbye and told me he'd be working all day. He'd been carrying a little girl who couldn't have been more than 3 years old. She'd had dark curls and was wearing a bright red dress with tiny white flowers. Even from across the street, I could see that she had Jimmy's distinctive green eyes, the same eyes that had made me fall in love with him 8 years ago. The little girl had been giggling and calling him Daddy in a voice that carried across the quiet suburban street. Jimmy had been making funny faces at her, the same goofy expressions he'd made when playing with Eleanor's children at family gatherings. But this wasn't his niece or a friend's child, this was his daughter. I'd watched frozen in horrified fascination, as Jimmy had buckled the little girl into a car seat in the back of the silver Honda. The pregnant woman, who had to be his girlfriend, his partner, the mother of his children, had climbed into the passenger seat. Jimmy had leaned over to kiss her forehead before getting behind the wheel, and the tenderness of the gesture had been like a knife through my heart. This wasn't an affair. This wasn't a casual relationship, or a moment of weakness. This was a family. Jimmy had another family, complete with a house in the suburbs, a pregnant girlfriend, and a toddler who called him Daddy. As I'd watched them drive away, Jimmy carefully checking his mirrors, driving slowly and safely like the responsible father he apparently was, the full scope of his betrayal had crashed over me like a tsunami. For years, while I'd been struggling with fertility treatments and grieving our inability to conceive, Jimmy had been raising a child with another woman. While I'd been supporting his business and sacrificing my own dreams for our future together, he'd been building a completely separate life with someone else. The drive home had been a blur of tears and rage and disbelief. I'd pulled over twice to throw up on the side of the road, my body rejecting the reality of what I'd witnessed. By the time I'd reached our driveway, I'd felt like a completely different person than the woman who'd left the house 2 hours earlier. That woman had been naive, trusting, devoted to her marriage. The woman who'd returned had seen the truth with her own eyes, and she was ready to burn down everything Jimmy had built on the foundation of his lies. The journey to Maple Grove Avenue had taken 20 minutes. The journey back to who I really was, Katrina Gilmore, not the submissive Katrina Baltimore I'd become, had taken 8 years. But now that I'd found my way back to myself, Jimmy was going to discover exactly what he'd awakened. Back in Jimmy's office, I methodically went through every file, every drawer, every hidden compartment I could find. What I discovered over the next 2 hours painted a picture of deception so elaborate and calculated that it took my breath away. Hidden behind his business insurance documents, I found a second set of tax returns, ones that showed Jimmy filing as head of household with 2 dependents, Lily Keene, age 3, and Marjorie Keene, listed as his domestic partner. The address was 247 Maple Grove Avenue. According to these documents, James Keene had been claiming them as dependents for 3 years, receiving significant tax benefits that he'd never mentioned to me. But that wasn't the worst part. The income reported on these secret tax returns was nearly double what Jimmy had ever told me he was making. While he'd been claiming that business was slow, that we needed to be careful with our spending, that he couldn't afford to contribute more to our household expenses, he'd actually been earning enough to support 2 families comfortably. I found bank statements for an account I'd never known existed, a business account for Keene Construction LLC. The deposits were substantial and regular, showing a thriving company that bore no resemblance to the struggling business Jimmy had described to me. Worse, many of the client names were familiar, people I'd personally referred to him, contracts I'd helped him secure through my family's connections. My networking, my father's introductions, my family's reputation, it had all been used to build a business that was supporting another woman and her children, while Jimmy cried poverty to me. The next folder contained insurance documents that made my blood run cold. Jimmy had life insurance policies on both Marjorie and little Lily, but more disturbing was what I found underneath. Research he'd been doing on life insurance fraud, articles about policies that paid out in cases of accidental death, and printouts about how long companies typically investigate suspicious claims. My hands shook as I realized Jimmy hadn't just been living a double life, he'd been planning for contingencies. What would happen if one of his families became inconvenient? What would happen if maintaining 2 households became too expensive or too risky? I thought about all the dangerous activities Jimmy had encouraged me to try over the years. The rock climbing expedition where he'd insisted I go without a safety rope for a more authentic experience. The skiing trip where he'd convinced me to try a black diamond run despite my intermediate skills. The sailing adventure where he'd suggested we go out despite small craft warnings. Each incident had seemed like Jimmy being adventurous, pushing me to be braver, to live life more fully. Now I wondered if they'd been something else entirely. In the very back of his filing cabinet, I found a folder labeled Personal Research that contained printouts about inheritance laws in our state. Specifically, what rights surviving spouses had to their deceased partner's assets, and what happened to those assets if the spouse also died within a certain time frame. There were also documents about my family's wealth, detailed research about Gilmore Developments, my parents' assets, my trust fund, information that Jimmy had gathered systematically over the years, learning exactly what he'd stood to gain by being married to me, and what he'd lose if our marriage ended. But the most chilling discovery was a handwritten timeline, tucked inside a book about estate planning. It laid out a careful progression. Year 1 Mentor 3, establish business and credit. Year 4 Mentor 6, build client base and legitimacy. Year 7 Mentor 8, consolidate assets and position for maximum benefit. Year 9, 10, execute exit strategy. We were currently in year 8 of our marriage. I found more evidence of his methodical approach to deception in a small address book that contained 2 sets of contact information for many of the same people. His crew members all had 2 phone numbers, their real numbers and what appeared to be code names. Gary, the supposed co-worker who I now knew was actually Marjorie, had multiple entries: Gary work issues, Gary family stuff, and Gary emergency only. Even more disturbing was what I found on his computer. Jimmy had apparently forgotten to log out of his email, and his inbox told the story of a man managing 2 completely separate lives with frightening efficiency. There were emails with contractors and suppliers under his real name, James Keene, discussing projects I'd never heard of. There were sweet domestic messages to Marjorie about grocery lists, daycare pickups, and doctor's appointments for Lily. There were even emails about their second child, discussions about baby names, nursery decorations, and maternity leave. While I'd been taking fertility drugs and enduring painful procedures, Jimmy had been exchanging excited emails with Marjorie about their growing family. While I'd been grieving our inability to conceive, he'd been planning a future with another woman and the children they were having together. The email thread that broke my heart completely was titled Our Forever Home. Jimmy and Marjorie had been house hunting, looking at larger properties in better school districts. They'd been planning to move their family, his real family, into a beautiful 4-bedroom colonial that cost twice what Jimmy claimed he could afford. The down payment for their dream home was supposed to come from the sale of assets he'd been accumulating under my name. Properties, investments, and business holdings that I'd unknowingly helped him acquire, all of which he'd been planning to liquidate to fund his new life with Marjorie and their children. In the very last email I read, dated just a week ago, Jimmy had written to Marjorie, "Soon we won't have to hide anymore. I've got everything in place for a clean transition. By Christmas we'll be in our new house, and this whole complicated situation will be behind us. A clean transition." He'd been planning to leave me, probably around the holidays when the emotional impact would be most devastating. He'd been systematically positioning himself to take as much of my money as possible while abandoning me with nothing but debt and broken dreams. But Jimmy had made one critical error in his calculations. He'd assumed I would remain the naive, trusting woman who'd supported him unconditionally for 8 years. He'd counted on me being too heartbroken and confused to fight back effectively. He didn't know that finding out about Marjorie and Lily had awakened something in me that he'd never seen before. The Katrina who'd discovered his betrayal wasn't the same woman who'd been folding his laundry that morning. This Katrina had resources, connections, and a burning desire for justice. And she was about to show Jimmy Baltimore exactly what happened when you underestimated a Gilmore. The war he'd started by betraying me was about to become a battle he couldn't win. With all of Jimmy's secrets spread across his desk like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, my mind began the devastating process of reconstructing 8 years of memories with this new, horrifying context. Every moment, every conversation, every gesture that I'd treasured as evidence of our love story now revealed itself as something entirely different. I started with our wedding day, that beautiful September afternoon that I'd always considered the happiest day of my life. Jimmy had been so nervous that morning, calling me 3 times even though tradition said we shouldn't talk before the ceremony. "I just needed to hear your voice," he'd said each time, and I'd been so touched by his romantic anxiety. Now I realized he hadn't been nervous about marrying me. He'd been nervous about committing fraud, because that's what our marriage was, an elaborate fraud designed to give him access to my family's wealth and resources. When he'd stumbled slightly over his vows, when his voice had cracked with emotion, I'd thought it was because he was overwhelmed by love. Now I knew it was probably because he was lying through his teeth while standing in front of God and 150 witnesses. Our honeymoon in Tuscany took on a sinister new meaning as well. Jimmy had been so insistent on documenting everything, photos of us at every restaurant, every landmark, every romantic sunset. He'd even hired a professional photographer for one afternoon, saying he wanted perfect pictures to remember our perfect trip. But those photos weren't souvenirs of our love. They were evidence for his long-term con. Proof that he was a devoted husband, documentation of our luxurious lifestyle that he could show to banks when applying for loans, to contractors when building his business reputation. Every romantic moment had been a photo opportunity for his deception. I thought about the first time I'd brought Jimmy home to meet my parents. He'd been so charming, so genuinely interested in hearing about my father's business, so impressed by our family's success. "You never told me your family was this accomplished," he'd said later that night. "I feel like I should be trying harder to impress them." What I'd interpreted as humble admiration was actually reconnaissance. Jimmy had been calculating exactly what my family was worth and how he could position himself to access it. His questions about the business hadn't been polite conversation, they'd been intelligence gathering. The memory that hurt most to recontextualize was the night Jimmy had proposed. We'd been together for 2 years, and I'd been starting to wonder when he might pop the question. He'd seemed to sense my impatience, and had planned what I'd thought was the most romantic proposal in history. He'd taken me back to the park where we'd had our first official date, recreating every detail of that afternoon. The same blanket, the same wine, even the same selection of cheese and crackers he'd brought 2 years earlier. As the sun was setting, he'd gotten down on one knee and pulled out the Tiffany ring we'd picked out together. "Katrina," he'd said, his green eyes bright with what I'd believed were tears of joy, "you've made me a better man. You've shown me what it means to have dreams worth fighting for. I want to spend the rest of my life proving I'm worthy of your love." I'd cried when I said yes, overwhelmed by the perfection of the moment and the beauty of his words. Now I realized that every word had been calculated. He hadn't been promising to spend his life proving worthy of my love. He'd been promising to spend however long it took to extract maximum value from our relationship before moving on to his real life. Even our struggles with fertility, which had brought us closer together in ways I'd thought were genuine, had been part of his manipulation. I remembered the night I'd come home from my first appointment with the reproductive endocrinologist, devastated by the news that getting pregnant might be more complicated than we'd hoped. Jimmy had held me while I cried, stroking my hair and murmuring comforting words. "We'll figure this out together," he'd promised. "Whatever it takes, however long it takes. We're a team, Kat." But he'd already had a child with Marjorie by then. Little Lily would have been about 6 months old when Jimmy was comforting me about our supposed fertility issues. He'd been coming home from diaper changes and midnight feedings to hold me while I grieved the children we couldn't have. The cruelest part was how convincing his performances had been. When I'd started hormone treatments that made me emotional and physically uncomfortable, Jimmy had been the perfect supportive husband. He'd brought me ice cream when I was bloated, rubbed my feet when the medications made me retain water, held me during the inevitable monthly disappointments when the treatments didn't work. He'd even gone to counseling with me when the stress of infertility had started affecting our relationship. I remembered sitting in Dr. Morrison's office while Jimmy talked about how much he wanted children with me. How he'd love our baby whether we conceived naturally or needed medical help. How the most important thing was that we were facing this challenge together. Every word had been a lie. While he was in therapy talking about wanting children with me, he was going home to Marjorie and playing with the child they already had together. I thought about all the times Jimmy had encouraged me to work late, to take business trips, to spend weekends with Eleanor or my college friends. "You're so independent," he'd say admiringly. "I love that about you. I never want you to feel like marriage means giving up your friendships or your career." What I'd seen as respect for my autonomy was actually him creating opportunities to spend time with his real family. Every girls' weekend I'd taken, every late night at the office, every business conference I'd attended, Jimmy had been using my absence to live his authentic life with Marjorie and Lily. The most devastating realization was about the house hunting we'd done last year. Jimmy had seemed genuinely excited about finding our forever home, as he'd called it. We'd spent months looking at properties, and I'd been so happy to see him engaged in planning our future together. Now I knew that while we were looking at houses for our imaginary future, Jimmy was secretly house hunting with Marjorie for their real future. The 4-bedroom colonial they'd chosen was probably everything I'd said I wanted in our dream home. He'd used my own wishes as a template for the house he was buying with another woman. Every memory was contaminated now, every happy moment revealed as a lie. The man I'd loved, trusted, and supported for 8 years didn't exist. Jimmy Baltimore was just a character James Keene had created to steal my life, my money, and 8 years of my future. But Jimmy had underestimated the woman he'd been deceiving. The naive Katrina, who'd believed his lies, was gone, replaced by someone harder, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous to his carefully constructed world. He thought he knew me, but he'd only known the character I'd played for him, the devoted wife, the generous supporter, the trusting partner. Now he was about to meet the real Katrina Gilmore, and she was nothing like the woman he'd been manipulating. She was about to become his worst nightmare. I sat in Jimmy's office chair, surrounded by the wreckage of our marriage, and felt something I'd never experienced before, a cold, calculating clarity that cut through the devastation like a surgical blade. The tears had stopped, the shock had passed. What remained was pure, focused determination. Jimmy would be home in less than 2 hours, expecting to find his devoted wife waiting with dinner and a smile, ready to listen to carefully crafted lies about his day. Instead, he was going to find that his entire world had shifted while he was playing house with his real family. But I wasn't going to confront him, not yet. Confrontation was what the old Katrina would have done, the woman who believed in communication and working through problems together. That woman was gone. In her place was someone who understood that information was power, and that the person who controlled the narrative controlled the outcome. My first priority was protecting my assets. I pulled out my laptop and logged into our joint bank accounts, the ones where my trust fund payments were automatically deposited each month. The balance was lower than it should have been. Jimmy had been systematically transferring money to accounts I didn't have access to. But there was still enough to cause serious damage if he realized I knew the truth, and decided to drain everything out of spite. I started with the largest joint account, transferring 3/4 of the balance to my personal account that predated our marriage. I left enough money to avoid triggering automatic alerts, but took enough to ensure Jimmy couldn't disappear with everything if he panicked. Next, I called our credit card companies. I need to report potential fraud on my accounts, I told each representative, giving them the story I'd practiced in my head. I've discovered charges that I didn't authorize, and I'm concerned someone may have access to my cards without my knowledge. It wasn't technically a lie. Jimmy had made charges without my knowledge, just not in the way the representatives would assume. Within an hour, I'd frozen 3 credit cards and reduced the limits on 2 others. Jimmy would still have access to enough credit for normal daily expenses, but he wouldn't be able to make any major purchases or cash advances without my explicit approval. Then I called my attorney, Margaret Thornton, who'd handled my family's legal matters for 20 years. Margaret had drawn up our prenup, or rather she'd drawn up the prenup that Jimmy had refused to sign, claiming it showed a lack of trust in our relationship. "Margaret, it's Katrina Baltimore," I said when her secretary put me through. "I need to see you tomorrow morning. It's urgent, and it concerns my marriage." "Of course, dear," Margaret said, her voice immediately shifting to professional concern. "Are you all right? You sound stressed." "I'm fine, but I've discovered some things about Jimmy that are going to require immediate legal action. I need to know what options I have for protecting myself financially. I'll clear my morning schedule. Can you be here at 9? I'll be there." My next call was to my father. Robert Gilmore had built his business empire by being smarter, more prepared, and more ruthless than his competition when necessary. If anyone would know how to systematically destroy someone who'd betrayed the family, it was him. "Dad, I need your help," I said when he answered his direct line. "It's about Jimmy." There was a pause. "What's he done?" I gave him the condensed version, the secret family, the hidden business, the systematic financial deception. My father listened without interrupting, and I could practically hear his mind working through the implication. "Son of a bitch," he said finally, his Irish accent becoming more pronounced the way it always did when he was angry. "How long has this been going on?" "Years, maybe since the beginning. Dad, he's been using our family connections, our reputation, our money to build a business that's supporting another woman and her children. He's been playing the long con on all of us." "Where are you now?" "At home. He doesn't know that I know yet." "Good. Don't let on that anything's changed. Can you keep up the act for another day or two while we put some things in motion?" The question surprised me. The old Katrina would have said no, would have insisted on immediate honesty even if it meant giving up strategic advantage. But the new Katrina understood that sometimes deception was a weapon, and sometimes the person who'd been betrayed had the right to use every weapon at their disposal. "Yes," I said, "I can do that. I'm going to make some calls. There are people who can help us understand exactly what this bastard has been up to, and there are ways to make sure he pays for every penny he's stolen." "But, Katrina?" "Yeah? This is going to get ugly. He's going to fight back when he realizes we're on to him. Are you prepared for that?" I looked around Jimmy's office, at the evidence of his betrayal scattered across his desk, at the photos of the daughter he'd hidden from me for 3 years. "I'm prepared for whatever it takes," I said, and meant it. After I hung up, I carefully returned all of Jimmy's documents to their original locations. I cleaned up any signs that I'd been searching through his things. I wanted everything to appear normal when he came home. Then I went to our bedroom and started planning the performance of my life. For the next day or two, I would need to be the perfect wife, Loving, trusting, completely unaware that my world had just imploded. I would need to smile and laugh, and pretend that everything was exactly as it had been that morning. It was going to be the hardest acting job I'd ever done, but it was also going to be the most important. Because while Jimmy thought he was getting away with the perfect crime, I was going to be building the perfect trap. By the time I was finished with him, James Keene would understand that there were consequences for stealing from a Gilmore. And those consequences would be more devastating than anything his small-time con artist mind could possibly imagine. I heard his truck pulling into our driveway and took a deep breath. Showtime. The woman Jimmy was about to greet at the door looked exactly like the wife he'd left that morning. But inside, she was someone completely different, someone who was about to teach him that the biggest mistake of his life had been underestimating exactly who he'd chosen to betray. The sound of Jimmy's key in the front door sent adrenaline coursing through my veins, but I forced myself to remain calm. I was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of his favorite chili and acting like the devoted wife I'd been that morning. The performance had to be perfect. "Hey, beautiful," Jimmy called out, his voice carrying the same warm affection it always did. "Something smells amazing. Just thought I'd surprise you," I replied, turning to smile at him as he walked into the kitchen. He looked exactly the same as he had when he'd left for work. Same clothes, same easy grin, same green eyes that had once made my heart skip a beat. Now they made my stomach turn. He wrapped his arms around me from behind, kissing my neck in the familiar way that used to make me melt into him. Now I had to fight not to flinch away from his touch. "How was your day?" I asked, continuing to stir the chili while he held me. "Long. That kitchen renovation is turning into a nightmare. The clients keep changing their minds about everything." The lie rolled off his tongue so effortlessly. He'd probably been helping Lily with her afternoon snack and reading her stories before nap time. "How about you? What did you get up to?" "Oh, just the usual. Some client calls, a little housework." I turned in his arms and smiled up at him. "I organized your gym bag while you were gone. It was such a mess." For just a split second, something flickered across his face, surprise, maybe concern. But it was gone so quickly I might have imagined it. "You didn't have to do that," he said, his voice still casual. "But thank you. You take such good care of me." The irony of his words was almost too much to bear. I was taking care of him, all right, but not in the way he meant. That evening passed like a surreal nightmare. We ate dinner together, watched television, discussed our weekend plans. Jimmy was his usual charming self, asking about my work, telling funny stories about his crew, planning a date night for Friday. Every word, every gesture, every loving look was exactly the same as it had been for 8 years. But now I knew it was all an elaborate performance. While he was discussing what movie we should see on Friday, he was probably mentally calculating whether he could fit in a family outing with Marjorie and Lily on Saturday. While he was holding my hand during our evening walk around the neighborhood, he was probably thinking about the bedtime routine he was missing with his daughter. The hardest part was going to bed with him. Jimmy fell asleep easily, his arm draped across my waist in the familiar way that had always made me feel safe and loved. Now it felt like a cage. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and listening to him breathe, wondering how many nights he'd done this, fallen asleep next to me while his heart belonged to someone else. The next morning, I waited until Jimmy left for work before putting the second phase of my plan into motion. I drove across town to meet with Margaret Thornton, carrying a folder full of evidence I'd copied from Jimmy's office. Margaret's law firm occupied the top 3 floors of a downtown high-rise, with a view of the city that reminded everyone who entered that they were dealing with serious people who handled serious money. Margaret herself was in her 60s, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, with a reputation for being absolutely ruthless when protecting her clients' interests. "Show me everything," she said, after I'd given her the basic outline of Jimmy's betrayal. I spread the documents across her conference table, the secret tax returns, the hidden bank statements, the insurance policies, the house hunting emails. Margaret examined each piece of evidence with the methodical precision of a surgeon, occasionally making notes on her legal pad. "This is comprehensive fraud," she said finally. identity theft, tax evasion, potentially insurance fraud if he was planning what I think he was planning. We have grounds for both criminal charges and a civil suit that would leave him with nothing. What about Marjorie and the children? I asked. I don't want them to suffer for Jimmy's crimes. Margaret studied me with approval. That's very generous, considering what he's put you through. We can structure the recovery to focus on assets that came from your family's money specifically. The legitimate business income he's earned can remain accessible to support his children. The meeting lasted 3 hours. By the time I left Margaret's office, I had a comprehensive legal strategy that would not only recover everything Jimmy had stolen, but would ensure he faced serious criminal consequences for his years of deception. But the legal strategy was just one piece of the puzzle. My father had been busy too. That afternoon I met him at his office, where he'd assembled what he called his A-team, the private investigators, forensic accountants, and business consultants he used when corporate espionage or fraud threatened his company. "We've found some interesting things," my father said, gesturing to the 3 serious-looking people seated around his conference table. "Your husband has been busy." The lead investigator, a woman named Diana Sharp who looked like she could have been a federal agent, opened her laptop and began walking me through their preliminary findings. "James Keene has been running this operation for longer than just your marriage," she said. "We found evidence of at least 2 previous relationships where he used similar tactics. Wealthy women who supported his business ventures before he disappeared with significant assets. My blood ran cold. He's done this before, multiple times. There's a pattern going back at least 10 years. He targets women with family money, particularly those who work in fields where they have useful business connections. He builds relationships, gains access to their resources, and then vanishes when he's extracted maximum value. So I'm not the first," I said numbly. "No," Diana said gently, "but if we do this right, you'll be the last." The forensic accountant, a quiet man named Dr. Chen, had traced Jimmy's financial activities across multiple states and identities. The scope of his deception was staggering. He'd stolen over $2 million from his previous victims combined, and he'd taken nearly that much from me over the course of our marriage. "The good news," Dr. Chen said, "is that we can trace most of the money. He's not as smart as he thinks he is about hiding assets." My father leaned forward. "Here's what we're going to do, sweetheart. We're going to give Mr. Keene exactly what he's been planning to give you, except he's going to be the one left with nothing." As they outlined their plan, I felt something I hadn't experienced since discovering Jimmy's betrayal. Hope, not just hope for justice, but hope for something I'd never thought possible. "We're going to destroy him," my father said simply. "Legally, financially, and professionally. By the time we're finished, James Keene will never be able to run this con on another innocent woman." For the first time in 2 days, I smiled. A real smile, not the fake one I'd been wearing for Jimmy. The woman who'd discovered those receipts in a gym bag was gone forever. In her place was someone stronger, smarter, and absolutely committed to making sure that Jimmy Baltimore's reign of deception ended in complete and total ruin. The only question left was how much he would suffer before it was over. The war room my father had assembled in his office looked like something out of a corporate thriller. Diana Sharp had set up multiple monitors displaying financial records, property deeds, and surveillance photos. Dr. Chen had covered one entire wall with a timeline of Jimmy's activities across 3 different identities. The sheer scope of his operation was breathtaking in its audacity and terrifying in its sophistication. "Let's start with his current setup," Diana said, clicking through a presentation that made my stomach churn. "James Keene operates under multiple legal identities, all carefully constructed and maintained. Jimmy Baltimore is just his latest persona." The screen showed driver's licenses, social security cards, and credit reports for 3 different men who all had Jimmy's face but different names and backgrounds. James Keene, Jimmy Baltimore, and someone called Jake Beaumont, who apparently lived in North Carolina. "How is this even possible?" I asked, staring at the documentation that looked completely legitimate. "Identity theft combined with sophisticated forgery," Diana explained. "He starts with deceased individuals who died young, then gradually builds documentation around their identities, birth certificates, school records, employment history, all carefully fabricated over years." Dr. Chen pulled up financial records that made my head spin. The Baltimore identity was specifically created to target you, Mrs. Baltimore. He researched your family for months before your sister's wedding, studying your social media, your family's business dealings, even your college roommates to understand your background and preferences. I felt sick, so everything about our meeting was planned, down to the last detail. He got himself hired by that catering company, specifically because he knew your family was using them for the wedding. He studied you long enough to know exactly what kind of man you'd be attracted to. Hard-working, humble, someone who seemed uninterested in your family's money. The screen displayed pages of notes in Jimmy's handwriting, character sketches that described my personality, my weaknesses, my family dynamics. It was like reading a psychological profile, written by a predator studying his prey. He's been running versions of this con for over a decade, Diana continued. Each identity targets a different type of wealthy woman. Jake Beaumont married a tech heiress in Silicon Valley. He disappeared with nearly $3 million after convincing her to invest in a fake startup company. What happened to her? I asked, dreading the answer. Suicide, Diana said quietly. 6 months after he vanished, she'd lost everything: her inheritance, her business, her faith in her own judgment. Her family found her in her apartment with a note that blamed herself for being so stupid and trusting. The room fell silent. That could have been me. If I hadn't found those receipts, if I hadn't discovered his secret family, Jimmy might have eventually executed whatever exit strategy he'd been planning, and I might have ended up like that poor woman in California, destroyed and convinced it was my own fault. Before the tech heiress, there was Rebecca Morrison in Texas, Diana continued. Real estate fortune, similar age and background to you. He used the identity Thomas Mitchell with her. Married for 6 years, convinced her to invest in multiple fake business ventures, then disappeared when she started asking questions about inconsistencies in his stories. Is she? I couldn't finish the question. Alive, but barely. She lost her family's ranch that had been in their family for 4 generations. Last we heard, she was working as a waitress and living in a trailer park. She never recovered financially or emotionally. My father's face was stone cold with rage. How many others? We found evidence of at least 6 marriages over 12 years. Combined theft of over $10 million, 2 suicides, 1 attempted suicide, 3 women who lost everything and never recovered. Diana paused, looking directly at me. You would have been number 7, Mrs. Baltimore. And based on the insurance policies he took out on you, you might not have survived to tell your story. The insurance documents Dr. Chen displayed made my blood freeze. Jimmy hadn't just taken out policies on my life, he'd been researching accidental death scenarios, studying which activities had the highest likelihood of fatal outcomes while appearing accidental. The rock climbing, the extreme skiing, the sailing in bad weather, Dr. Chen said, reading from Jimmy's notes. He was creating a pattern of risk-taking behavior that would make an accidental death seem plausible. The insurance companies would pay out without extensive investigation if you died during an activity you were known to enjoy. I thought about how enthusiastic Jimmy had been about those dangerous adventures, how he'd pushed me to try things that scared me, how he'd always had such detailed plans for our adventure dates. He'd been auditioning different ways to kill me. But the secret family changes everything, Diana said. Maintaining 2 households was expensive and risky. My guess is that he was getting sloppy, which is why you found the receipts. He was probably planning to accelerate his timeline. What do you mean? I think he was getting ready to eliminate one of his problems, my father said grimly. Either you or the other family, and based on the insurance policies and his research into accident scenarios, I think we know which option he was leaning toward. The room was quiet as the full horror of Jimmy's plans sank in. He hadn't just been stealing my money and living a double life, he'd been planning my murder. But here's the thing, Diana said, her voice taking on a predatory edge that reminded me why my father had chosen her for his team. James Keene made a critical error when he chose you as his target. What do you mean? He assumed you were like his previous victims, isolated, dependent on him, without the resources or connections to fight back effectively. He didn't account for the fact that you're a Gilmore. My father leaned forward. And Gilmores don't just have money, sweetheart. We have power, we have connections, and we have a very long memory when it comes to people who cross our family." Diana smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression I'd ever seen. Mr. Keene is about to discover that there's a difference between stealing from isolated wealthy women and stealing from a family that owns half the judges in 3 states and has the resources to hunt him down anywhere in the world. "What's the plan?" I asked. "We're going to give him exactly what he's been planning to give you," my father said. "Complete destruction, but unlike him, we're going to do it legally, systematically, and permanently. He's going to wish he'd never heard the name Gilmore," Diana added. "And by the time we're finished with him, he'll never be able to hurt another woman again." For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something other than devastation and rage. I felt anticipation. James Keene had spent 12 years destroying innocent women. Now it was time for him to experience what that felt like from the other side, and the Gilmore family was going to make sure it was a lesson he never forgot. The final phase of our operation required me to become someone I'd never been before, a calculating actress, capable of maintaining an elaborate deception while Jimmy walked unknowingly into the trap we were setting. For 3 days, I had to be the perfect wife while secretly orchestrating his complete destruction. Diana had equipped me with surveillance devices that looked like ordinary jewelry, a pendant necklace with a hidden camera, earrings with audio recording capabilities, and a wedding ring that had been replaced with an identical one containing a GPS tracker and listening device. Every conversation Jimmy and I had was now being recorded and analyzed by her team. "The key is to act exactly as you normally would," Diana had instructed me. "Don't try to get him to confess or reveal information. Let him hang himself with his own words while you gather evidence of his daily deceptions." Dr. Chen had given me a modified phone that appeared to function normally, but was actually feeding Jimmy's location data, call logs, and text messages directly to our investigation team. Every move he made, every person he contacted, every transaction he completed, was now being monitored and documented. Margaret Thornton had been busy too, filing sealed court documents that would freeze Jimmy's assets the moment we were ready to spring the trap. She'd also prepared criminal complaints that would be delivered to multiple law enforcement agencies simultaneously, ensuring that Jimmy couldn't escape by fleeing to another jurisdiction. But the most crucial preparation was psychological. I had to maintain my emotional equilibrium while living with a man I now knew was a serial predator who'd been planning my murder. Every morning when Jimmy kissed me goodbye, every evening when he held me while we watched television, every night when he whispered, "I love you," before falling asleep, I had to respond as if I believed him while knowing he was calculating the best way to kill me. The first test came on Wednesday evening when Jimmy suggested we go out for dinner to celebrate a big contract he claimed to have landed. I smiled and agreed, letting him choose the restaurant, acting excited about his supposed business success. The hidden camera in my necklace recorded him lying smoothly about his day, while I forced myself to look impressed and supportive. "You've been working so hard lately," I said, reaching across the table to take his hand. "I'm so proud of everything you've accomplished." "I couldn't have done any of it without you," he replied, squeezing my fingers with what looked like genuine affection. "You've been my rock, Kat. I don't know what I'd do without you." The irony was so bitter, I almost choked on my wine. He was right. He couldn't have built his criminal enterprise without stealing my money, using my connections, and exploiting my trust. But he was about to find out what happened when the rock he'd been standing on turned out to be quicksand. Thursday brought an even more challenging test when Jimmy suggested we start looking at houses again. "I know we've been putting it off because of business expenses," he said, over breakfast. "But I think we're finally in a position to move into something bigger, maybe start seriously trying for kids." The casual mention of children while he had a pregnant girlfriend and a toddler across town nearly broke my composure, but I managed to smile and nod enthusiastically, even suggesting we call a realtor that weekend. "I'd love that," I said, my voice steady despite the rage burning in my chest. It's time we started building our real future together. That afternoon, while Jimmy was supposedly at a job site, our surveillance team followed him to 247 Maple Grove Avenue, where he spent 2 hours helping Marjorie pack boxes. They were preparing to move into their new house, the 4-bedroom colonial they'd been planning to buy with money stolen from me. Diana's team also discovered that Jimmy had scheduled a business trip for the following week, a trip that corresponded exactly with Marjorie's due date. He was planning to be there when his second child was born, probably spinning some elaborate lie to me about having to work out of town. The most damning evidence came Friday evening when Jimmy received a phone call during dinner. He'd stepped outside to take it, claiming it was about a work emergency, but our listening devices picked up every word. "I know, baby, I miss you too," he'd said to Marjorie. "Just a few more weeks and we won't have to do this anymore. Once everything's finalized, we can be together all the time. Lily keeps asking when Daddy's coming home to stay." Marjorie's voice came through clearly on our recording equipment. "Tell her soon. Tell her Daddy's going to come home and never leave again. We just have to wait a little longer while I take care of some business." When he returned to the table, Jimmy was all smiles and apologies. "Sorry about that. Big client with an urgent problem. You know how it is." "Of course," I'd said, cutting into my salmon with hands that wanted to strangle him. "Work comes first." By Saturday morning, we had enough evidence to destroy Jimmy completely. His financial crimes, identity theft, bigamy, and conspiracy to commit murder were all documented with overwhelming proof. The trap was set, the legal paperwork was filed, and law enforcement was standing by. But I wanted one more thing before we brought his world crashing down. I wanted to look Jimmy in the eye and let him know that his perfect victim had turned out to be his perfect predator. Diana had scheduled the final confrontation for Sunday evening, when Jimmy returned from what he'd told me was a day-long job consultation, but was actually Lily's third birthday party. Our surveillance team had photographed him playing with his daughter, cutting her birthday cake, laughing with Marjorie's family. While he was celebrating his real life, I was preparing to end it forever. "Are you ready for this?" my father asked when he called to check on me Saturday night. I looked around the house that had been my prison of lies for 8 years, at the photo gallery documenting our fake marriage, at the bedroom where I'd slept next to a man who'd been planning my murder. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life," I said. Tomorrow, James Keene would discover that the biggest mistake a predator can make is choosing prey that's more dangerous than he is. And he was about to learn that lesson in the most devastating way possible. Sunday evening arrived with the weight of finality. Jimmy had left that morning for what he'd told me was a consultation with a potential commercial client, but I knew he was actually at Lily's third birthday party. Our surveillance team had sent me photos throughout the day, Jimmy pushing his daughter on a swing, helping her blow out candles shaped like unicorns, holding his pregnant girlfriend while she rested her hand on her belly. While he was creating precious family memories with his real family, I was preparing to destroy his life forever. At exactly 6:30 p.m., Jimmy's truck pulled into our driveway. I watched through the living room window as he sat in the cab for a moment, probably transitioning from loving father back to deceitful husband. When he finally came through the front door, he was carrying a small bouquet of flowers and wearing the guilty smile of a man who thought he was hiding a harmless secret. "Hey, beautiful," he said, kissing my cheek and handing me the flowers. "Sorry I'm so late. That client was incredibly demanding." "These are lovely," I said, taking the flowers that he'd probably bought at a gas station on his way home from his daughter's birthday party. "How did the consultation go?" "Really well, big project, lots of potential." He loosened his tie and headed toward the kitchen. "I'm starving. Did you eat already?" "I waited for you," I said, following him. "I made your favorite pot roast with those little potatoes you like." The normalcy of the scene was surreal. Here we were, playing our usual roles, the devoted wife who'd spent her day cooking for her hard-working husband, the grateful man coming home to a woman who loved him unconditionally. It was the same performance we'd been giving for 8 years, except now only one of us was acting. During dinner, Jimmy told me elaborate stories about his fictional consultation while I smiled and asked supportive questions. He was such a convincing liar that if I hadn't known the truth, I would have believed every word. Even now, watching him perform, part of me could understand how I'd been fooled for so long. "You seem different tonight," he said, as we were clearing the dishes. "Relaxed, maybe. You've been kind of tense lately." "I'm just happy," I said, which was actually true. I was happy that his lies were about to end, happy that justice was finally coming, happy that after tonight I'd never have to pretend to love a man who'd been planning to murder me. At exactly 8 p.m., our doorbell rang. Jimmy looked confused. "Are we expecting someone?" "Actually, yes," I said, setting down the dish towel and walking toward the front door. "I invited a few people over. I thought it was time you met some new friends." The confusion on Jimmy's face deepened as I opened the door to reveal Diana Sharp, 2 FBI agents, and Margaret Thornton. Behind them stood my father, his expression as cold as winter stone. "Jimmy," I said, my voice perfectly calm, "I'd like you to meet some people who are very interested in talking to you about your work." The color drained from Jimmy's face as Diana stepped forward, her badge clearly visible. "James Keene, also known as Jimmy Baltimore, Thomas Mitchell, and Jake Beaumont, you're under arrest for identity theft, mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and bigamy." "What the hell is going on?" Jimmy demanded, but his voice cracked, and his eyes were already darting toward the back door, calculating escape routes. "The game's over, Jimmy," I said, pulling the hidden camera from my necklace and setting it on the coffee table between us. "We know everything. About Marjorie and Lily, about your previous wives, about the insurance policies, and your research into accident scenarios, about all of it." Jimmy's mask finally slipped completely. The charming, devoted husband disappeared, replaced by something cold and predatory. "You conniving bitch," he snarled. "You have no idea what you're doing." "Actually, I know exactly what I'm doing," I replied. "I'm giving you the same thing you gave Rebecca Morrison, and Sarah Chen and all your other victims. I'm destroying your life the way you destroyed theirs." The FBI agents moved forward with handcuffs, as Jimmy's bravado crumbled into panic. Wait, you don't understand. I can explain everything. Katrina, please, you have to listen to me." "I listened to you for 8 years, I said. "Every lie, every manipulation, every false promise. I'm done listening." As they cuffed him, Jimmy's desperation became pathetic. "I love you, Kat. Whatever you think you know, whatever they've told you, I love you. That was never fake." I looked at this man who'd stolen 8 years of my life, my money, my trust, and my dreams, who'd planned to murder me for insurance money while building a family with another woman, who'd left a trail of destroyed women across multiple states. "The only thing that was never fake," I said quietly, "was how much I'm going to enjoy watching you rot in prison." Margaret stepped forward with a folder of legal documents. "Mr. Keene, you're also being served with divorce papers, asset seizure orders, and a civil suit seeking full restitution for the approximately $4 million you stole during your marriage to my client." "You can't do this," Jimmy shouted as they led him toward the door. "I have rights. I have a family to support." "Your family will be fine," I called after him. "I've made sure Marjorie and the children will be taken care of. They're victims in this too." And they were. Whatever anger I felt toward Marjorie for her role in this betrayal, she and her children were also casualties of Jimmy's manipulation. The trust fund I'd established would ensure they could survive without the stolen money Jimmy had been using to support them. After the police car disappeared down our street, my father put his arm around my shoulders. "How do you feel, sweetheart?" I looked around the house that had been my prison for 8 years, then at the legal documents that would soon make me Katrina Gilmore again, then at the future that stretched before me, uncertain but finally, truly mine. "Free," I said. "For the first time in 8 years, I feel completely free." Jimmy Baltimore was gone forever. James Keene would spend the next 20 years in federal prison, where he'd have plenty of time to reflect on the mistake of targeting a woman who had the resources and the will to fight back. And Katrina Gilmore was finally ready to discover who she really was when she wasn't performing love for a man who'd never deserved it. 3 weeks after Jimmy's arrest, I found myself sitting across from Marjorie Keene in a small coffee shop downtown. She looked exhausted, her pregnancy making her appear fragile and overwhelmed. When she'd called asking to meet, I'd almost said no, but something in her voice, a broken quality that I recognized from my own mirror, had changed my mind. "I don't know what to say to you," she began. her hands wrapped around a cup of herbal tea. I knew he was married, but he told me you were separated, that the divorce was just taking time because of business complications. I studied her face, looking for signs of deception, but saw only genuine pain and confusion. How long? I asked. 4 years. We met when he was working on a renovation project near my apartment. He was so sweet, so attentive. He said his marriage had been over for years, but that his wife was making the divorce difficult. She paused, touching her belly. He promised me we'd be married as soon as he was free. 4 years, which meant Jimmy had started his relationship with Marjorie, barely 4 years into our marriage, during the time I'd thought we were happiest. While I'd been helping him build his business and planning our future, he'd been building an entirely different future with her. Did you ever suspect? I asked. Sometimes, she admitted. He could only stay certain nights. He never wanted me to call him at work. He insisted on keeping our relationship private until his divorce was final. She looked up at me with tears in her eyes. But I loved him. And when Lily was born, when I saw how much he loved her, I thought I was just being paranoid. What will you do now? I don't know. I lost my job when this all came out. My employer didn't want the scandal. The house we were renting was in his name, so I had to move back in with my parents. She paused, then added quietly, I heard about what you did. The trust fund for Lily and the baby. Why would you do that after everything we put you through? I thought about her question. In the immediate aftermath of Jimmy's arrest, my first instinct had been to hate everyone connected to his deception. But Marjorie and her children were victims too, manipulated by the same skilled predator who'd fooled me for 8 years. Because Lily didn't choose to have a criminal for a father, I said finally. And your baby didn't ask to be born into this mess. They deserve a chance at a normal life, even if their father stole that from them. Marjorie began crying then, silent tears that spoke to a grief I understood completely. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry for all of it. I know, I said, and meant it. When we parted ways outside the coffee shop, I felt something I hadn't expected: closure. Not forgiveness for Jimmy, that would never come, but a kind of peace about the collateral damage his crimes had caused. Eleanor had been right when she'd told me weeks earlier that healing meant understanding the difference between the people who'd betrayed me and the people who'd been betrayed alongside me. Marjorie and her children would be fine. Jimmy would not. And finally, so would I. Walking back to my car, I realized that the woman who'd discovered those receipts in a gym bag was truly gone forever. In her place was someone stronger, wiser, and absolutely certain that she would never again mistake manipulation for love. The future was mine now, and I couldn't wait to see what I'd build with it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.